I am Blaine Carter, Oracle's developer advocate for open source. There's my contact information if you need to get a hold of me for any questions, comments, or suggestions. In this series, we're going to take a look at using the CX Oracle open source Python utility to perform some basic CRUD operations against an Oracle database. CRUD, of course, being create, read, update, and delete. For those who prefer a written tutorial, this series and all of the examples can be found on my blog at learncodeshare.net. Before you get going, there are some prerequisite steps that can be found in the introduction and setup video. In this section, we'll take a look at updating data in the database. We'll perform a simple update, talk about using good where clauses, and go over how to check the number of rows affected by the update. I'll be using a helper function called getAllRows. Basically, it's just a simple select statement that we'll use to verify that the data changes worked. The select functionality is covered in the read section of this series, so we won't go into the details here. To keep the examples clean, I will reset the data from time to time. I'm going to use a file called resetdata.py. This file won't be covered in the tutorial, but you can find it on my blog. Let's do a simple update. First, we get a cursor from our connection. Then we prepare the update SQL using positional bind variables. Then we'll execute the prepared statement using the values of 31 and 1. And finally, we'll commit. When we run the code, we see the original data from before the change, followed by the new data after the update. Now you'll notice in the new data, Bob's age has changed to 31. We're going to change the boilerplate a little bit here so that we can get the pet data instead of the default people data. Alright, let's go ahead and reset our data. For this example, Bob is moving to an apartment that doesn't allow large dogs, and Duke is a pretty large dog, so he's going to go live with Kim. So just like before, we get a cursor object from our connection, we prepare a SQL statement and bind variables that change the owner to Kim, where the current owner is Bob and the type is dog. We execute the statement and commit the transaction. In the results, we can see that the owner of Duke has changed from 1, which is Bob, to 2, which is Kim, and this is what we wanted. But if we look over here, we see that Buster's owner has also changed from Bob to Kim. Now Buster's a small dog, and Bob was planning to take him to the new apartment. In our example, we had only used owner and type in the where clause, assuming that Bob only had one dog, Duke. Now this is how it was in our original data set. However, in the reset data function we used for this section, we added a second dog, Buster. It's a very good practice to ensure that your data design includes at least one way to uniquely identify each row. And this should be enforced by a database constraint. When you intend to make changes to a specific row, you should use this key if at all possible. Our first example would have been fine if we had intended to move all of Bob's dogs over to Kim, but since we really only intended to move Duke, we should have used Duke's ID. Now even using Duke's name wouldn't have been an ideal choice since there's no unique constraint on the name. Now let's give Buster back to Bob. This time we'll use the unique ID column and we'll print out the number of rows affected using cursor.rowCount. This is pretty much the same as before, except for we're using Buster's ID to make sure it's just him. And here we use the row count function of our cursor object to display the number of rows changed, and you can see in the results that only Buster was moved. You may not always be able to predict how many rows are affected by a change, especially when a user is involved, but it's a good idea to return the row count so then they can decide if it's correct. For example, let's say that our user decided to give Kim all of the birds that she doesn't already have. Now, once again, this code is pretty much the same as before. We set the owner to 2, which is Kim, where the type is bird, and the owner is not already 2. After the change, we display the row count, showing the changed rows so that our user will know how many birds have been changed. So that's a pretty quick overview on how to use Python and CX Oracle to update data in the database. All of the example code can be found on my blog at learncodeshare.net. If you found this useful, please like the video and subscribe to my channel.